Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alina. I'm the moderation of this meeting today, and I'm happy to be here with you. The meeting will be held in English and German, and one of the talks has also been translated into Persian for those who are interested. Today's meeting at the Iranian Wisdom House about the Imamate and leadership in Sunni and Shia thoughts. Imamate and leadership are important and widely discussed topics in Islamic thoughts, and they are still studied in universities and research centers around the world. This meeting is being held about 50 days after the martyrdom of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the former leader of Iran, in order to honor his memory. So, first of all, our first speaker is Professor Amin Hor. He's a researcher in Islamic history and also a high-level expert in artificial intelligence. Dr. Hor's historical discussions are very precise and engaging for students. I kindly invite him, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Mr. Chairman, thanks for inviting me here today. As Timothy sort of said, my name is Amir Hor. I'm sort of interested in the analytical history and history of civilizations and empires, and I do research on type of historical human histories. Human histories and the pattern of histories. So today, obviously, I'm not going deep into history since the history is a big thing. It takes a lot of time to go through any single event of history. So that is just with what I present today is just a glimpse of a governance in history, and how it comes down into the Islamic era, and what we should expect as we go down the sort of a road of a time now towards the turbulence time today. Okay. So obviously, if you talk about the governance, there are a lot of aspects of governance. The history of governance, starting from the rural governments, the royals, empires, and continental empires, and the structure of them. There are a lot of aspects which I'm not going through here. It's just the introduction that obviously we have what we have as the governance sort of the concepts in the history. Includes a lot of aspects, like structure, tools, political, economical, social, and the other aspects. When you look at if I just go and sort of try to define a core concepts of the governance, it can be just said that, okay, normally if you open a textbook on the governance, it says governance refers to the mechanisms, processes, and institutions through which collective decisions are made and enforced within a society. It extends beyond formal state structures to include informal norms, networks, and international regimes. That's just the very broad definition of the governance, which obviously develops through the history. So you have the system of governance, processing, decision making, the people, the governor and people interface, the interactions, societal organizations, and the power structure within the governance. Now, if you look at the historical term, the governance rules and the governance structures evolved from a very early civilizations, like ones in the Mesopotamia, called Bahrain, Egyptian civilization, Chinese civilizations, Greek. Essentially, there's a timeline of this developments and evolutions in the history, how the government structure and all these components essentially evolve and develops. So in very old era, you might have a tribal, local monarchies, regional governments like in Bein al-Nahrain, as I said, the Mesopotamia, the medieval governances, like land owners and all this big type of feudals and things. Empires, when we especially starting had the Roman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, Persian Empire, and then obviously you end up in today, which is called the democracies, all this type of a nation-state government and a modern government as we know it. But that's just the history trend of evolving governance. So if you look at the structure of this governance, you sometimes end up in having a centralized or decentralized systems. You might have an authoritarian or democratic, what we call a democratic government, which in a sense democratic or democracy needs to be defined here. Or hybrid models, but two very, very important aspects of the governance, which is quite important to understand in the analytical history, to really look at the performance and the type of roots of the government. It's a soft power and hard power part of the government. So every government in the history, it had some type of a softer and some type of a hard hardware. And I would go through the soft power and hard power terms to really define it so we can get into our own discussion of the Islamic type of civilization, how the governance in Islamic term should be. So, on soft power, obviously you would look at the different type of aspects of the soft power for any type of a government. You would have an identity, which is very, very important for any type of a nation, and the governance over the nation. We got spirituality, religion, social cohesion, all these aspects of the soft power. You might have a language, race, values, and history. That's, again, this is a very important part of the soft power or software of any type of governance. Culture, ideologies, diplomacies, and all, and the intellectuals and the intellect of the people are all part of this soft power. I mean, there are other aspects which I didn't list here because you see you have to go through a lot of aspects, but there are the soft power of any type of a governance, empire or government structure is quite influential in terms of how government is performing, how it's sort of interacting with its people, how it's interacting with the other governments, and how essentially it's survived through the history. Because that's quite important to understand that the soft power was the key to really survive in the history. So in hard power, obviously, you got issues like land. If you have a big land, fertile land in old time, the fertile land was really, really important aspects of any type of government. Military strength, military power, army. The population, if you have a bigger population, you would have a sort of edge over your competitors. Economic power, that's quite important. Water, which was a main driver of the civilizations of all time. Without the water sources, you would not obviously survive. Minerals, geography, which is quite important if you are on the crossroad of the type of civilizations and the people who are sort of doing their business and things, that's quite important. So geography, geopolitical positions, this is all components of this hard power, which shapes the power of any type of government to really put and force its influence over the people, its own people, or the neighbors. So these two aspects of hard power or hardware and software of the governance is very, very important for realizing how the governments essentially perform. So if you look at the, I'll just listed two type of example here. Many times, you would sometimes look at the history and you would end up with these named civilizations, but you have also empires, government or local governments, monarchies and things. And there are different concepts. Is it that every civilization ends up in the empire building, or are they the same? Every civilization is an empire, or every empire needs to be a civilization? That's quite important to understand how these type of concepts, as we know them, really perform. Like on civilization, normally the civilization starts with the soft power. So the people have sort of an identity shared between them. And then that would start a type of a sparkle of the initial stages of the civilization. And obviously when they start to grow, the main driver is the soft powers, that identity, that type of soft power which sort of attract the people, and then they get it together and start to build in their civilization. So it's essentially a soft power base. Civilizations are, and then they expand obviously to, but for defending themselves, they start to having a hard power as well. So any type of a civilization need to have a hard power to defend itself. Otherwise, it would be just omitted from the history because of the other competitors. So, but the hard power, it comes as the defender of the whole entity, not as a driver for the growth and the survival. So it's expanding through the soft power and obviously protected by the hard power. And it's obviously, if you look at the civilization, they are very long-lasting in the history. You could see the trace of the Egyptian civilizations even today. You will see all these aspects of, let's say, Persian Empire and Persian civilization today. So the civilization, even if it becomes an empire, is a soft power of that civilization which survives in the history, not the hard power of the empire. The hard power of the empire would just remove, would disappear from the history. But empires, which doesn't have essentially that type of a background, civilization background, they're starting from just having some initial soft and hard power, but they're fast developing a hard power to really expand. So like if you look at the Greek or Macedonian type empire with Alexander the Great, they call it the Great Alexander, that was a sort of very good example of this type of empires, the Seleucid Empire, which started very much on the very initial type soft power, and then very quickly developed the hard power to go and sort of attack the others, get very, very big land, obviously expanding to the forts and capturing lands and all the people. But then, when you look at that empire, that didn't last even 200 years, really. There are different accounts in the history, but if you look at the history, it was very, very short-lived. And you cannot see any trace of it in the history, because there was no civilization behind, there was no soft power behind this type of empires. While empires with the civilization part still lives even today, while the hard power of empire would just remove. So empires without the backing of civilization, they are very limited periodical influence on the human history, and normally you would just see them on the history books. Now, when we talking about now is civilization and religion, that's a very, very interesting aspect of the type of history. What is the relations of the civilizations and the religion? So this religion essentially is one of the most powerful soft power in the world, because that would generate the identity, which is really, really powerful. It goes through languages, races, sexuality, everything, unify all the aspects of the people. So essentially the religion is one of the most powerful soft power of the human history. So it would enable a type of a soft power within inside the individual, not just the enforcing on people. It's just coming from the inside of the people. They believe on something, and then they would sort of show this belief on the society. That's really, really powerful and different from a type of a law enforcing from outside. So you have the soft power which grows first in the hearts and minds of the people, and then materializes as the society. It generates social resilience, coherence, and a social identity, which is very strong social identity. So any civilization essentially based on the religion would be very, very, in terms of soft power, it would be very, very powerful. And nothing compared to this. So now I'm sort of turning to the Islamic civilizations. I just sort of listed some terms in terms of definition of what I sort of think Islamic civilization is based on. So it's defined based on basic beliefs, identity, spirituality, and culture. That's a basic Islamic civilization. It starts with hearts and mind. And it's just embedment of the rule of God. So the rule of God essentially inside you would force you to externally act. Create intrinsic soft power through personal and societal identity, very strong identity. Spread through winning hearts and mind and basic human instincts, not through force. The Islamic civilization would not go through forcing and land capturing things. That's the empire. That's not Islamic civilization. It's a knowledge base, so it's based on the real knowledge inside. And it's a dynamic, so you would have the type of jurisprudence or jurisdictions, which is essentially changing and adapting to time. It generates social resilience and prosperities through the fairness and justice. So that's the basic part, the foundations of the Islamic civilization. Now, I just, after I defined these things, I wanted to enlighten here by going through some questions, to really basic questions, to really understand what is the Islamic civilization, Islamic empire looks like. And I sort of raised this question that should Islamic civilization transform into Islamic empire? Is it the force of history that if you have a civilization developed by the Islamic religion, is it has to go through the normal stage of making empires and then going to the empire-like actions like seizing land and things and forcing people to bring and come into the Islamic war? What are the basic differences between a wider Islamic society, what we call the Ummah, and mosaic empire societies? If you look at the empires, they would capture all these people with different languages and things, and they would use this mosaic type of state, which they might have a head, but the head would be responsible to the empire, the emperor. So, is it like this for the Islamic type of societies, or is it the Ummah is a single entity based on the religious identity, not just the type of a different local type state which it has its own, but it would be ruled under the empire? Should hard power used to bring nations under guidance and within Islamic society, or should hearts and mind be won before any inclusion? Should we, if you have the power, you have the power of the religion, you have the hard power of the army, should we go and capture people and say, okay, you have to come to Islam, and then guide them to Islam by force, and try to really bring them into an understanding by sort of putting them under the force? That's the basic question. So essentially moving from the civilization to that type of empire-like actions. Did the young Islamic civilization turn into the ill-fated empire by premature transformation? Did we have essentially first 100 years after the Prophet, we have that type of a turning and transformation from a civilization into empire by just going around, try to capture as much as land and people, and calling it obviously dawah or guidance and bringing other people under the religion. But is it allowed in Islamic thinking and civilization to really go and do these things? And did Islamic empire survive in the history? I mean, the civilizations obviously survived. We have 1.5 billion people, 1.8 billion Muslims. But did the Islamic caliphate or caliphate, did they survive through the history? And I mean, like other empires, like the Roman Empire and others, that type of structure of the governance has disappeared, but that soft power just flows into the history. Is the caliphate system of governance more related to empire-like administration or Islamic leadership, what we call it Imamate? And that's a basic question here, that is it really that if you look at the history of caliphate, I mean from the starting of the Rashidin, and then the Umayyads, and then obviously the Abbasi and all this caliphate, they call it caliphate. Did it really act like a head of a just single civilization, Islamic civilization, or did they act like an empire, Islamic empire? Which they call themselves Islamic empire. So Islamic governance and soft power. So how do we really developing a soft power if we have really Islamic what we call Islamic civilization? So if Islamic, I mean the soft power or identities and all this spirituality or the culture and things would be generated obviously first, and any type of hard power, which is the army or the type of wealth and things, is sort of just to defend and make the civilization survive. Yeah. And I just listed 3 things here because the main aspects I want to talk on the next couple of minutes. Expansion of the civilization is not through land seizure or forced submission. That's not allowed in the any type of a religion-based civilization, because the submission needs to be internally, not through the reinforcing of external force. It is based on the society pyramid of spirituality. So that's a concept I want to sort of elaborate a little bit more on the next slide. That what it means by the pyramid of spirituality. So obviously, when you look at the governments of in the history, you would have the governor, it might be a king or an emperor or whatever, and then coming down into the societies, you would have the peasant or people who really work and things, and obviously you might end up, if you have a type of a father and son system, which essentially they consider our parents, you might end up with the people coming into that head or top of the pyramid of the governance, which in no way in history they were deserved to. So you end up with the people who were absolutely had no managerial type of qualities, but they become an emperor or become kings and things, and that goes completely against what we conceptualize as the Islamic civilization, the Islamic governance. Because on Islamic governance, the idea is the pyramid, as you get over to the top of the pyramid, you have more pious people, you have more type of intellectuals. So the people, essentially, the quality is increasing as you go to the top of the pyramid. Against the normal empire, when you end up with the people who are very, very much corrupt on the top. That's becoming a problem. So that brings an idea of how the people essentially abiding the governance. Are they abiding it by heart, or is it that they have to oblige by the rule of law? And rule of law means a man-made rule by the emperor or the king or whatever. So the essential difference, basic differences here between the Islamic governance and the normal empire or the government. So when you look at the Islamic or governments, ideal Islamic governments, you're moving towards self-restraining and conscious-based obediences, not by forcing of law. I mean, that's what I'm saying is the primary. There are people obviously in the civilization which not abide by the law. But that's primarily, when you look at the ideal situation with Islamic governance, people would be self-restrained. They would abide the rule because their heart says to do. So that would bring the harmonizing and unifying internal and external human wars. There's a sort of big topic, this type of harmonizing and unifying human spirituality inside. And what you get as the external human, I mean, the forcing of a law on the humans. Like, I mean, I can give it probably a very quick example. If I'm working for the government or in the army, and they start a war, which I know there's no justice in that war, that would essentially generate the internal conflict, because internally I know that I'm fighting for things which is not just, not fair, this is not really right. But by external enforcing law, I'm a soldier, I have to fight, I have to perform. It's like the same for if you're a government officials and you know it's the corrupt things. But internally, well, you want, I mean, that conflict between internal and external type is happening normally in the governance of the normal governance, which is sort of material-based governance. In Islamic governance, there's a harmonizing and unifying, because your fitra, your instinct inside, it says what is essentially happening on the outside. That's a basic argument with harmonizing and unifying internal and external human goals when you're sort of living under the ideal Islamic governance. Well, if you really look, as I said, just living under the empires for normal government, even today, I'm not talking about the empires normally, today, you're living in US or other, you would have a conflicting internal and external human goals. You can search through internet now and see the people resigning things because they really cannot take it anymore. Internally, they cannot take the things which they have to do under the rule of what they call the rule of law. But internally, they know that is wrong. So that's very, very basic type of aspects of the human obedience. Forced obedience, unwilling submission, and escape route prone system. So the people try to find escape route to really, either they would, sometimes even you see the suicide and things because internally they cannot take the things anymore. And obviously this system intrinsically creates inequality or rebellion, because when the top of this pyramid becomes corrupt, the people start to think, okay, this really inequality has to end. And that's normally, you see a lot of revolutions and all this renegations and things through the history. And that's all because of that type of obedience. So, I'm not, probably take more five more minutes. But so, what is, I mean, for us now, what is the situation in terms of future governance? We will see the world situation at the moment. We will see the superpowers. We've seen the Soviet Union. We see the US now. We see the situation of the world, and you wonder what would be a way of the governance for the future. I just listed a couple of things here. I go through them and just very quickly just elaborate on them. Evaluation of historical experience of human societies. Based on all these histories of the empires, ruler type governance, kings, royals, and things, which you see some of them today, even trace of them today. These experiences, what does all these experiences are sort of giving us? What is it that is sort of showing us to do today? If you want to just look at all these experiences and choose a way forward, what would be this way? What would be the way for the future? Transformation of obedience due to force of history. So we've seen all these obediences our external obediences to the rule of law, what they call the rule of law. It might be a law of the emperor or the others. And you would wonder, would the human race essentially get to the stage that they would say, okay, I want to harmonize my internal and external. I want to avoid the things which internally I'm happy with and externally acting on. That's a basic part of the being a future idea of future government. Change of governance structure based on power of hearts instead of power of laws. That's a basic point. So you would have, in ideal government, you would have a people essentially coming with hearts forward, not really forced by the law. If they're driving, you would see no cameras, go through it. But that's because there's a rule of law, and the rule of law cannot be sort of practiced here. But if you have really a self-restraint, would you do that? If you really believe that that's wrong, and internally I feel that that is wrong. So that type of a change of a structure on the obedience side, and going through the hearts instead of forcing the laws, that would be a really key to the future governance. So returning to basic human instinct, you see, as we now see the situation sort of coming, and you will see the situation of the war, the people, all these aspects of I don't want to go through obviously a lot of, and sort of assess the situation now, because you will see it on the internet. But looking at all these things, is it not the time to really go back to your instinct, internal beliefs and things? And obviously, looking at the situation with the Earth and all this global warming and things, that looks to be a people who are really running on the government. They have some agendas which is not really on the benefits of all the human race. So that's really basic point. So adaptive and resilient governance system, adaptive system, dynamic system, and prosperity, rational freedom and humanity. I put the rational freedom because sometimes when you say freedom, it might just, definition might be a bit very wide. And what does it mean, the freedom and humanity? So that's essentially ideal situation. I believe that it would be good for the, obviously a future governance, and what we call, what we believe as Imamate governments. So in conclusion, obviously I wanted, instead of obviously going through some summarizing what I said, I want to raise some questions here, because that would be really, might trigger some thinking. And I go through these basic discussions and questions, and I finalize my talk here. And so, what is the best governance for human societies based on the historical experience? Going through all the history and seeing all this type of experiences of different governments, what we are thinking of in terms of the best choices we have. Does human history repeats itself in cycles or moves according to rules of creation? So there's a famous phrase in the history that says, okay, the history repeats itself. But is it true, or is it really we are now moving towards a type of a final stages of the human race paths, and we need really to now have a type of a choose something very important selection here. When will the human intellectuals and cognitive forces take the humanity and human race? You look at the artificial intelligence, all this aspect which is now coming into play, and the understanding of our the humans, of the external world. Would they really force them to really take a path of correcting ourselves, or correcting the governance of the human race? Or is it really going to go into nowhere? You will look at the way that these tools are used today, and you would wonder which path we would really go as a human race. How should the soft and hard power be integrated to create a balanced government structure? So when you look at the religion as the most powerful soft power, how do you implement that religion today to really create a governance which is resilience, which is going into the heart of the people believe it, act based on it. And that's very important. I want to make this balance between a very, very wild, I mean, you will see the word of violation of all the human dignities and things. There's wars and things going on. I mean, if we look at the number of wars in 20th century and 21st centuries, I mean, you would wonder what is happening essentially with the humans, and is it this type of violence and things going to continue, or is it we going to put some type of a soft power, fair and justice soft power into the system to really correct this type of the way we are going at the moment? Are we approaching the end of a time? That's a very, very famous question. Are we on the final stages of the human existence? There's a lot of type of discussions on the end time and things. And I think we are moving towards a really big choice here, that we are standing on the crossways of the history at these stages to see where we're really going with this. There are, as I said, there's things which are showing that the human race is in danger. We know that there are the people who are running the world today might end up we may end up in a situation with these people that is really dangerous. So, in terms of that crossroad, how the human race should change that path we are going down right now, it's really, really quite an important topic, which I suppose we can talk in different meetings. But we, as a Shia people, believe that we need to turn into this type of spiritual pyramid, and the people gets into the system where, as we go up into a system of governance of the world, you will see more pious people, more just people, more intellect people, and that's a way to really end up with this violent world, essentially. So, are we ready for the world imamate government and flourishing human life on the earth? Yeah, as I said, we now trying to move essentially from the type of a system which experience, especially in the 20th and 21st century, because if we look at carefully on the 20th and 20th century, especially the 20th and 20th century, was a milestone in the whole human race history, because the event happens on the 20th century would really it changed a lot of human understanding, how we live, how we understand the world, and it's sort of extending into 21st century. As a final type of statement, I just want to say, obviously we as Muslims and as a people who believe that the God essentially created the human beings, and the God and Allah wants to really make us essentially guide us through the path of His own type of creation. These societies and all these people which is living in this world, essentially, there's only a single way of going back to the basic guidance of the God, and that's through the winning the heart of the people, bringing these hearts and minds out into an action, and then make this action into a world stage government. And that's what we call the reappearance of the Imamate place. So thanks for having me today. I sort of did a copy of this presentation is on my Telegram page if you're interested to look at it, and the QR code is there. Thanks for having me, and sorry it was probably overshoot a little bit. Thanks.
1953 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, was educated in Sarajevo at Gazi Bek Madrasa, graduated in 1972. In 1973, he became the first official appointed imam sent to Austria by the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He studied at the University of Vienna, Oriental Studies, Philosophy, Islamic Studies, Education, and completed a PhD in Religious Studies, focusing on the concept of jihad. From 1982 to 2019, he worked as an Islamic religious educator teacher in Vienna. I would like to invite you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Sehr geehrter Herr Vorsitzender, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Assalamu alaikum. Ich werde meine Ansprache mit einem Ausspruch von Emir al-Mu'minin von Imam Ali radiallahu anhu beginnen. Er sagte einmal, al-Ulama'u baquna ma bakiya dahr. I'yanuhu mafudatu wa ansaluhum fil qulubi mawjudatu. Die Übersetzung auf Deutsch wäre, die Gelehrten bleiben bestehen, solange die Zeit besteht. Ihre Körper fehlen, doch ihr Vorbild bleibt im Herzen der Menschen. Ich habe lange nachgedacht, was ich heute wirklich anlässlich dieser Tagung zu sprechen soll. Wir wissen, dass wir eine Einheit sein müssen. Wir waren und wir sollen darauf bestehen. Als ich die Einladung bekommen habe zu dieser Tagung, war ich wirklich sehr froh und mit großer Freude das auch angenommen. Ich konnte nicht ganz gleich bestätigen, dass ich zu der Tagung erscheinen werde, weil ich sehr verkühlt war. Später habe ich dem Organisator mitgeteilt, dass ich kommen werde und eine kurze Ansprache halten werde. Aus der Pflicht eines Muslims, den verstorbenen Märtyrer Imam Ayatollah Ali Said al-Khamenei. Als ich im Jahre 82 mit dem Unterricht an der Schule in Wien begonnen habe, war in der Klasse eine Mappe, Weltkarte und unter den anderen auch die Religionen. Das war im Juni im Jahre 1982. Und es war unter dem Islam nur einen einzigen Satz zu lesen, Islam. Es waren keine Trennungen, weder diese und jene, weder verschiedene Rechtsschulen noch die Fraktionen. Seit 82 bis zum Schuljahr 218/19 sind einige unter dem Schlagwort oder Wort Islam an der Wandkarte geschrieben. Und zwar Schiiten, Wahhabiten, diese und jene, dass ich jetzt nicht alle erwähne und spreche. Besonders jetzt, wo wir da sind, um uns an den großen Ayatollah zu erinnern, ist unsere Pflicht, wirklich im Sinne seines Lebens und Werkes daran zu arbeiten und zu halten, dass wir als eine Einheit auch weiter, wo wir auch leben und wo wir uns befinden, arbeiten und bestehen müssen. Ich werde deshalb nicht über die verschiedenen Fraktionen im Islam oder Wege, wie es Unterschied zwischen Kalifat oder was ist ein Khalifa, was ist ein Imam, weil alle beiden Wörter kommen im Koran vor. Alle beiden Wörter kommen im Koran vor. Aber mir liegt es als eine Pflicht, über diese großen Gelehrten, Führer, Faqih, Alim und so weiter zu erwähnen und ihnen mitzuteilen, wie wir ihn in Bosnien erlebt haben. Er war, und ich bin sicher, Ihnen ist das nicht bekannt, einer, der sich für den Muslimen oder für die Bevölkerung in Bosnien sehr engagiert hat, als der Krieg und Aggression im Jahre 92 bis 95 stattfand. Er war damals ein Imam in einer Moschee in Teheran. In seinen Freitagspredigt oder Was oder Khutbah, in der letzten Zeit habe ich 2 solche gehört, habe ich jetzt einige Punkte hervorgehoben, die er während der Khutbah, das heißt am Freitag, was für ein Mitleid mit den Muslimen in Bosnien gehabt hat. Rahmatullahi alayhi. Sogar weinte er bei seiner Ansprache in einer Moschee in der Stadt Teheran damals. Und aus diesem Grund bin ich heute hier bei Ihnen oder spreche vor Ihnen, weil ich das als eine moralische Pflicht sehe, dass man mindestens auf diese Art ihm danken soll oder sogar ja danken muss. Die islamische Weisen, Hukema, sagen, es gibt Zeiten, in denen man sprechen soll und es gibt Zeiten, in denen man schweigen soll. Ich bin der Meinung, dass wir in dieser Zeit sprechen müssen, nicht nur sollen, damit jeder von uns im Klar steht, in welchem Zustand wir uns oder Hal wir uns befinden. Ich habe aus seiner Predigt einige Punkte oder wollte ich einige Punkte Ihnen mitteilen, über denen ich sprechen werde. Und das war erstens auf dem Grund der Quellen des Islam. Und die Quelle nämlich den Koran und der Sunnah oder besser gesagt Hadith von Muhammad a.s. Muhammad a.s. sagte einmal, von Abu Huraira wurde überliefert, La yashkurullah man la yashkurun nas. Was heißt das? Das heißt, der Prophet Muhammad hat gesagt, wer den Menschen nicht dankt, dankt auch Allah nicht. Dass unsere Pflicht ist, ihm zu danken und besonders die Bosniaken oder die Bevölkerung in Bosnien danken ihm für alles, was er geleistet hat. Wenn man jetzt diese Hadith betrachtet und sieht, was Muhammad a.s. im Hadith gesagt hat, dann muss uns klar sein, dass wir gerade jetzt niemand in der Lage sein soll, und zu sagen, naja, es geht mir nicht an, was kann ich für ihn tun? Wir sollen mindestens ihn in eine gute Erinnerung behalten und ihn Dua lesen. Deshalb würde ich vorschlagen, dass wir jetzt alle Surat al-Fatiha für ihn und für alle Shuhada in dieser Aggression im Iran jeder für sich vorliest. Lillahi Fatiha. Das ist der erste Grund, was der Prophet Muhammad oder wie der Prophet Muhammad a.s. gesagt hat über die Dankbarkeit und Lob an die unseren Vorbeter oder diejenigen, die uns im schwierigen Zustand im Krieg in Bosnien getan hat. Zweitens, ich glaube, jeder von uns liest den Koran ständig und er findet im Koran, dass Allah, der Erhabene oder Jalla Jalalu, verlangt von uns, dass wir ihm dankbar sein und sofort auch dankbar den Eltern gegenüber. Man sieht aus diesen zwei Quellen, nämlich Koran und Hadith, wie wichtig die Dankbarkeit im Islam ist. Und deshalb versuche ich auch mit meinem Beitrag an ihn und für das im Allgemeinen iranische Volk Danken zu sagen für alles, was er bzw. das Volk geleistet hat. Über die Zufriedenheit oder Shukr im Allah, Shukr an Allah und Shukr an Menschen im Allgemeinen, glaube ich, ist nicht notwendig, viele Versen zu zitieren oder Hadithe, weil jeder von uns das im Koran nachschlagen kann. Aber was wichtig ist, dass wir diese Forderung von Allah aus dem Koran in unserem Leben umsetzen müssen, praktizieren müssen. Und leider heutzutage liest man ihn viel, aber lebt man nach ihm sehr wenig. In seiner Predigt hat er einmal im Khutbah gesagt, ja, unsere Brüder und Schwestern in Bosnien sind ein Teil von uns. Das sind seine Worte. Er fragte nicht, ob sie Hanefiten sind oder Malikiten oder Schafiiten oder was immer noch, sondern sagte, sie sind unsere Brüder, ein Teil von uns. Im Jahre 92. Wenn ich jetzt, damals konnte niemand sich vorstellen, dass meine Brüder und Schwestern oder das iranische Volk auch das fast gleiche und noch schlimmer erlebt, wie wir damals in Bosnien. Aber sein Beitrag für den Frieden im Allgemeinen und für die Zusammenarbeit aller Muslime war in Bosnien sehr empfangen. Und wir sind ihm wirklich dankbar. Er hatte auch aus seinen Worten kann man sagen, dass der westliche Mensch, das heißt ein Abendländer im Allgemeinen, kann sich alles erlauben. Warum? Weil sie so mächtig sind, weil sie eine Einheit sind, weil sie immer wieder betonen, dass wir nach ihrem Muster leben sollen. Alle anderen Arten des Lebens entweder sind nicht willkommen und ich kann sie nicht sogar auch tolerieren. Leider. Die Muslime müssen sich bewusst werden, dass wir nur im Sinne des Korans stärker sein können, weil Allah im Koran gesagt hat, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, wa'tasimu bihablillahi jami'an wa la tafarraqu. Wa'tasimu bihablillahi jami'an wa la tafarraqu. Hebt euch alle an Hablillah, an Allahs Pfeil und macht ihr euch nicht oder erlaubt euch nicht dazu entwernen, keine Gruppe zu machen. Der westliche Mensch kennt den Islam nicht und weiß deshalb nicht, dass in der Funktion des Propheten Muhammad a.s., Friede sei mit ihm, das Sakrale, das heißt das, was der Religiöse im Allgemeinen anbelangt, und Profane vereint sind. Der Prophet, Friede sei mit ihm, war als Prophet, aber auch gleichzeitig als Führer des Volkes oder Umma. Der Prophet Muhammad a.s. war also Vorbeter der Gemeinde, Imam, aber auch an der Spitze des islamischen Staates. Im Islam sind Religion Daula und Religion Dien und Staat Daula untrennbar. Untrennbar. Der Islam ist wirklich untrennbar. Der Glaube, Iman des Volkes muss so gestaltet sein, dass sie den Regeln des Korans entsprechen. Leider in heutzutage überall, mehr oder weniger, sind diese Praktizierung aus verschiedenen Gründen, auf verschiedene Arten auch zu verschiedenen Interpretationen gekommen. Man verlangt, dass man sich trennen soll. Das heißt die Religion oder der Glaube. Ich würde das Wort Dien als der Glaube übersetzen und nicht die Religion. und derlach stark, dass sie nicht zusammenpassen. Und das ist im Islam nicht akzeptabel. Im Islam und Politik und er als Imam in einer Moschee in Teheran hat also auch die Politik, die man aus dem islamischen Winkel nicht jedem bekannt war, sehr gut erläutert, dass diejenigen, die das versuchen zu trennen, auch versuchen, die Muslime zu entfernen von den Quellen des Islam. Und meine große Anliegen war, ihnen wirklich zu schildern, wie er damals, vielleicht viele von Bevölkerung konnten überhaupt nicht verstehen, dass der Krieg in Bosnien so hart war, sich in seinem Hutba für sie eingesetzt hat. Und er hatte immer wieder betont, dass die Pflicht eines jeden Muslims ist, den Muslimen in Bosnien und Herzegowina zu helfen. Und deshalb ist die Islamische Republik Iran damals auch an der ersten Stelle gewesen, die der Bevölkerung Bosnien und Herzegowina große Hilfe geleistet hat. Eine große Unterstützung war von der Seite des iranischen Volkes zu uns gekommen. Ich bete zu Allah, den Erhabenen, dass er ihn mit seinem Rahma belohnt und dass er ihm Jannat al-Firdaus schenkt. Er, wie Imam Amir al-Mu'min Ali schon in diesem Gedicht gesagt hat, bleibt im Herzen der Menschen, obwohl er nicht mehr unter uns ist und lebt. Möge Allah der Erhabene auch alle Märtyrer und alle Getöteten und ob jetzt die Kinder nämlich, die in der Schule waren oder auf der Straße oder im Bett in der Nacht, alle Verstorbenen sich erbarmen und ihnen Jannat Firdausi schenken. Assalamu alaikum.
Finally, our last speaker is Professor Dr. Bolani. He is the cultural representative of Iran in Austria and a lecturer in political philosophy, cultural studies, and civilizational studies. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your participating and contributing. Especially, I would like to appreciate Professor Hadzic, Professor Hor, and all of you that contribute in our program in the now and in the future. Every religious community with a clear vision must eventually face this question. Where does leadership come from? What makes it legitimate, and how is it passed from one generation to the next? In the Abrahamic religions, especially Christianity and Islam, this question has received different but deeply thoughtful answers. The main question of this lecture is: what are the theological foundation of leadership theories in Christianity and Islam, and what path have they taken throughout history? Alongside these main questions, several secondary questions arise. How did succession take shape in Christianity, and what are the differences between its branches? Why did Islam arrive at two different theories, Caliphate and Imamate, after the Prophet, peace be upon him, and what are the theological roots of each? And how did these two theories develop over time? Before we begin, one important point must be acknowledged is none of these religious traditions are uniform or speak with one voice. Christianity is divided into Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, each with its own internal variety. Islam spans Sunni with its four legal schools and various theological traditions, and Shia with its 12er, Ismaili, and Zaydi. What follows traces the main currents of these traditions and does not claim to cover all of their rich diversity. After Jesus Christ, leadership of the Christian community was handed to the apostles. They spread his message across the world and built an institutional foundation that still stands centuries later. In the Catholic tradition, the highest proof of leadership authority goes back to the rock and keys covenant in the Gospel of Matthew. In this text, Jesus changed Simon's name to Peter, meaning rock, and declared him the foundation of his church. By giving him the keys of the kingdom of heaven, he established a divine link between the rulings of earth and heaven. This passage presents Peter not merely as a preacher, but as the cornerstone of the Pope-centered Catholic system. From Peter, a chain of successors developed known as apostolic succession, a line of bishops and priests through whom the trust of leadership has been passed down each generation. In this tradition, the Pope is Peter's successor and the spiritual center of the Church, with a special authority to interpret matters of faith. But this model was not accepted across all branches of Christianity. In the Orthodox tradition, leadership was distributed in the conciliar was among the local churches. Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem each kept their independence, and no single authority holds universal power. The Protestants reject centralized leadership altogether making the Bible the sole authority. Every believer can connect with God directly without any intermediary. This principle, known as the priesthood of all believers, was a revolution in the concept of religious leadership. What all branches of Christianity share is that leadership is essentially spiritual, focused on teaching, guidance, and direction. Succession is Christianity is more institutional and collective, rather than resting on a single person with divine appointments in the strict theological sense. What about two theories, two theological horizons in Islam? After the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the question of the leadership became one of the most fundamental issues in Islamic history. Two great theories emerged from this question, each resting on different theological foundation: the theory of the Caliphate and the theory of Imamate. The theory of the Caliphate, which took shape among Sunni Muslims, begins from an important theological premise. The Prophet Muhammad is the seal of the Prophet, and with his passing, divine revelation came to an end. The Holy Quran states, ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبيين. Therefore, no successor can inherit the Prophet's religious authority and infallibility. What remains in the community's need for political leadership to maintain order, implement divine law, and protect the religion. Sunni scholars draw on verses such as وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ or وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. On this basis, the Caliphate is chosen through the community's pledge of allegiance and consultation, as began with Abu Bakr al-Siddiq. The Caliphate is neither divinely appointed nor infallible. He is a person the community has deemed worthy of his responsibility, and his authority flow from the consent and pledge of the people. His foundation, however, has never been without its critics. Some voices within the tradition have argued that the legitimacy of the consultative caliphate depends entirely on the quality and inclusiveness of the consultation itself. A council that lacks clear standards, broad representation, and an accepted process can lose its legitimacy and become the tool of the particular elites. This critique, raised repeatedly throughout Islamic history, shows that even within the Caliphate tradition, serious questions about how leaders are chosen have always existed. In this framework, religious scholars play an independent and important role. Juristic reasoning, or ijtihad, in Sunni Islam, divining rulings from the Quran. The prophetic tradition, scholarly consensus, and analogical reasoning, or ijtihad. operated in a relatively open and dynamic way in the early centuries, giving rise to the four legal schools: Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanafi, and Hanbali. However, from around the 4th Islamic century onward, a dominant view emerged among many Sunni scholars that the gate of Ijtihad is closed. That the great Imams of the four schools has already derived what needed to be derived. From that point, scholars were expected to follow these Imams and apply their rulings to new situations rather than reasoning independently from primary sources. This approach, known as the closure of the gate of Ijtihad, has a deep impact on the dynamism of Sunni legal thought in the medieval period. Though in modern time, a number of Sunni thinkers have thought to revive independence reasoning. The theory of the Imamate, on which 12er Shia is founded, approaches the question from a different theological direction. In this view, the leadership of the community after the Prophet cannot be merely a political matter, because the Islamic community, in order to continue receiving divine guidance, needs an authority that can interpret religion with depth and prevent deviation. For this reason, in the theory of the Imamate, leadership after the Prophet was handed not through collective election, but through explicit designation or nas, a clear appointment by the Prophet himself to Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace be upon him, and then to 11 Imams after him. There are the key Quranic verses of the Imamate. Al-Ma'idah 255. إنما وليكم الله ورسوله والذين آمنوا الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم راكعون. The verses of proclamation or ayah iblagh. Al-Ma'idah 67. يا أيها الرسول بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك وإن لم تفعل فما بلغت رسالته. Or the verses of completion. Ayah Ikmal. Al-Ma'idah 3. اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. And also the verse of authority. النساء 59. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. And the verses of purification. الأحزاب 33. إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. And so on. What about the defining qualities of the infallible Imam in 12er Shia Islam? First, being from the Ahlul Bayt. Second, the station of infallibility or ismat. 3, connection to the source of revelation. And 4, the station of the perfect human or al-insanul kamil. What about the Caliphate thought history? The theory of the Caliphate went through many ways rises and falls across history. The rightly guided caliphate or Khulafa Rashidin, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasi Caliphate, and finally the Ottoman Caliphate, each represented a different interpretation and lived experience of this theory. With the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, the Sunni world found itself practically without a single unified political authority. In the modern era, after the formation of nation-state, Sunni majority nation-states, Sunni majority countries took different paths. Religious leadership continued through institutions such as Al-Azhar Fatwa, council, and local scholars, but a single centralized religious authority never took shape at the level of the entire Sunni world. This diversity is both a strength and this tradition and one of its structural challenges. In the Shia tradition, when the accumulation or bay'at of the 12 Imam began in the 3rd Islamic century, a new question arose. In the absence of the Imam, how should the leadership of the community be organized? The Shia answer was the theory of deputyship or niyabat. Qualified religious scholars as a general deputies of the Imam take on the responsibility of guiding the community in religious matters. This theory developed over the centuries and in the modern era took the form of the guardianship of the jurist or Walayatul Faqih, a political religious system that found expression in the Islamic Republic of Iran. What distinguishes the theory of deputyship from a mere transfer of power is its deep connection with living juristic reasoning or ijtihad. Unlike the Sunni tradition, which effectively closed the gate of ijtihad in the 4th Islamic century, in Shia jurisprudence, ijtihad has always remained open and active. One of the foundational principles of Shia law is that following a deceased jurist is not permitted. Every believer must follow a living, qualified jurist. This principle, now as the requirement of the jurist being alive, means the juristic reasoning in every age must remain alive and active. A jurist cannot rely solely on the rulings of those who came before. He must reason independently from primary sources, the Quran, the prophetic tradition, and the narration of the Ahlul Bayt. The fruit of this structure is that Islamic law preserves its vitality in every era, and the work of guidance is always grounded in the living contemporary jurisprudence, not dependent on ruling derived continue ago. For this reason, the jurist who is qualified for deputyship in the age of the accusation draw his legitimacy not from the legacy of deceased predecessor, but from his own living and independent reasoning from primary sources. And this is precisely the link that makes the theory of deputyship an organic outgrowth of Shia jurisprudence. And my other talk about the idea of transdenominational leadership. Alongside these two main theories, contemporary experience has shown an interesting phenomenon that can be called transdenominational leadership. In practice, this idea has taken two distinct directions. The first direction is the movement that has chosen Islam without schools of law, al-Islam bila madahib, an approach that sets aside the classical legal schools and returns directly to the Quran and prophetic tradition. While this trend has its supporters in certain circles, it has not been broadly welcomed by the Muslim world as a whole, since it tends to disregard the rich jurisprudential and theoretical heritage of Islam, and in the view of many, oversimplifies the interpretive complexities of the religion. The second direction takes a functionalist approach to the leadership, evaluating leadership not on the basis of denominational affiliation, but no effectiveness, coherence, and the ability to protect the interest of the Muslim world. In this approach, the question is not to which school of law a leader belongs to, but whether we can guide the Muslim world in the face of shared challenges. For this reason, even among some Sunni communities, one can observe groups that in political matters, though not to theological or jurisprudential ones, recognize the leadership of Imam Khomeini and after him martyrs Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei as carrying significant influence of key strategic issues facing the Muslim world. This phenomenon arose not from accepting Shia theological beliefs, but from recognizing a coherent and independent leadership standing against external domination. Thank you for your attention, and thank you again, all of you.
Wir gelangen zu einem Ende unseres heutigen Programms und ich würde gerne noch allen anderen Gästen, die heute anwesend sind, und es gibt auch Veranstaltungen so dringend, dass ich mich auch gerne bei Ihnen bedanken würde, auf Persisch. از شما ایرانای عزیز به خاطر حضور گرم و صمیمانه در این نشست علمی تشکر میکنم. برایتان آرزوی سلامتی و توفیق دارم. I invite now all of you to the next room to enjoy some refreshments. Ich würde Sie gerne auch bitten, in den nebenan den Raum für ein kleines Buffet sich zu bedienen. Vielen Dank. Dankeschön.